It was just another Tuesday morning, but for the man standing nervously in the courtroom, it felt like anything but ordinary. He had been up all night, working tirelessly to care for patients who relied on him. Now, here he was, still in his scrubs, trying to navigate a situation that seemed far removed from his usual world of medicine and compassion. The courtroom wasn't crowded, just a few people scattered around, waiting for their cases to be called. There were lawyers shuffling papers, an elderly woman clutching her cane, and a bailiff leaning against the wall looking bored. But none of them paid much attention to the man in scrubs until the judge entered the room. Judge Richard Langston strode in with an air of authority, his robe flowing behind him as if to remind everyone exactly who was in charge. He took his seat at the bench, adjusted his glasses, and began scanning the room. His eyes landed on the man in scrubs almost immediately. A frown creased his face, and without hesitation, he spoke. "Why are you dressed so casually?" "Judge," Langston's voice boomed across the silent courtroom. "This is a court of law, not some hospital hallway." The man froze. All eyes turned toward him, and he suddenly became aware of how out of place he must have looked. Dressed in navy blue scrubs, with faint smudges of exhaustion under his eyes, he stood there awkwardly, unsure of what to say. It wasn't arrogance or disrespect that brought him here in this outfit. It was sheer necessity. After finishing a grueling 12-hour shift, he hadn't had time to change before rushing over to support an elderly patient whose case was being heard today. Before he could even think of responding, Judge Langston continued, his tone sharp and dismissive. "If you can't dress appropriately, maybe you shouldn't be here." The words hung heavy in the air, echoing through the quiet courtroom. The man felt his cheeks flush with embarrassment, but also something else. A flicker of frustration. Was this really how it was going to go? Would no one understand why he was here? The elderly woman sitting beside him leaned closer, her frail hand reaching out to touch his arm. Her voice was soft but firm when she whispered, "Don't let him get to you." Those simple words carried more weight than she probably realized. They reminded him of why he was here. Not for himself, but for her. She needed him, and that mattered more than any insult thrown his way. As the silence stretched on, the tension in the room grew thicker. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding eye contact with both the judge and the man in scrubs. Everyone waited to see what would happen next. Would he lash out, walk away? Or would he find a way to respond that might change the course of the conversation? For a moment, the man simply stood there, taking in the scene. He thought about all the years he'd spent proving himself, in school, during training, and later, in the hospital where he worked long hours to save lives. He'd faced judgment before, often because of the color of his skin or the fact that he came from humble beginnings. But each challenge only made him stronger, teaching him the value of patience, resilience, and grace under pressure. Now, standing in front of this judge, he knew he had two choices: stay silent and let the comments slide, or speak up and defend not just himself, but the values he believed in. Taking a deep breath, he decided it was time to make his voice heard. What happened next would leave everyone in the courtroom stunned, and perhaps even inspire a larger conversation about respect, empathy, and understanding in spaces where they're needed most. But for now, all anyone could do was wait and watch as the drama unfolded, wondering if the man in scrubs had the courage to stand up to the imposing figure seated above them all. The man standing in the courtroom wasn't someone who gave up easily. Life had taught him early on that challenges were a part of the journey, and if you wanted to move forward, you had to face them head-on. Growing up in a neighborhood where opportunities were scarce and hope often felt like a distant dream, he learned the value of hard work from watching his mother. She worked 2 jobs, cleaning offices late at night and cooking meals for families during the day, just to put food on the table and keep a roof over their heads. He remembered how she would come home exhausted but still find time to sit with him, helping him with homework or simply listening to his stories about school. Her sacrifices shaped him in ways he didn't fully understand until later in life. They taught him that no matter how tough things got, giving up was never an option. He carried that lesson with him into adulthood, using it as fuel to push through. obstacles that tried to hold him back. But life hadn't been kind to him in other ways. As a black man growing up in a society full of biases, he faced hurdles that others might not have even noticed. In school, teachers sometimes overlooked him when handing out praise, assuming he wouldn't achieve much. When he applied for scholarships, he was told he didn't meet the criteria, even though his grades were among the best in his class. And when he decided to pursue nursing, a field dominated by women and often misunderstood for men, he encountered skepticism from people who questioned whether he was truly cut out for such a demanding profession. Despite all of this, he refused to let negativity define him. Instead, he channeled his energy into proving doubters wrong. Nursing became his calling because it allowed him to do what he loved most: care for people. Every patient he treated, every family member he comforted, reminded him why he chose this path. It wasn't just about earning a paycheck. It was about making a difference, however small, in someone else's life. His decision to wear scrubs to the courthouse that day wasn't careless. It was practical. After finishing a long night shift, he'd rushed straight to the courthouse without a moment to spare. Changing clothes wasn't an option. Besides, those scrubs meant something to him. To him, they weren't just fabric stitched together. They were a badge of honor, a symbol of everything he stood for. They represented sleepless nights spent monitoring patients, quick decisions made under pressure, and moments of triumph when someone pulled through against all odds. As he stood there now, feeling the weight of the judge's words pressing down on him, memories of his journey flooded back. He thought about the times he'd been underestimated, dismissed, or judged unfairly. He thought about the countless hours he'd spent studying, practicing, and perfecting his craft. Most importantly, he thought about the elderly woman sitting beside him, the reason he was here today. She was frail, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped her cane, but her mind was sharp and her spirit was unbreakable. She needed him to be strong for her right now. He knew that. Her whispered words earlier, "Don't let him get to you," echoed in his ears, grounding him and reminding him of his purpose. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about showing respect, not only to himself, but also to the profession he represented and the people who depended on him. He realized that staying silent wouldn't solve anything. If anything, it would reinforce the idea that he didn't belong here, that his presence in scrubs somehow diminished the seriousness of the court. No, he couldn't let that happen. Not today. Not when so much was at stake. Not just for him, but for the elderly woman counting on him and for everyone else who might feel invisible in situations like this one. Taking another deep breath, he steadied himself. The room was still silent, the tension almost unbearable. But inside, he felt a spark of determination ignite. This wasn't the first time he'd faced judgment, and it likely wouldn't be the last. What mattered was how he responded. And he knew exactly what he needed to say. What came next would change the tone of the entire courtroom, and perhaps leave a lasting impression on everyone present. But before he could speak, he took a moment to reflect on how far he'd come, and how much further he still wanted to go. His scrubs weren't just clothing. They were a testament to his resilience, his dedication, and his unwavering belief in doing what was right, even when it was hard. As he prepared to address the judge, he felt a quiet confidence settle over him. Whatever happened next, he was ready. The courtroom was so quiet you could almost hear the clock ticking on the wall. Every eye in the room was fixed on the man in scrubs, waiting to see how he would respond to the judge's sharp words. The tension was thick, like a storm cloud, hanging low over everyone's heads. For a moment, it seemed like he might stay silent, like maybe he'd swallow his pride and let the comment slide. But then something shifted. You could see it in his posture, the way he straightened his back just slightly, as if gathering strength from within. He took one step forward, not aggressively but with purpose, and cleared his throat. His voice, when it came, was calm but firm. It wasn't loud or angry. It didn't need to be. There was a quiet power behind every word, the kind that makes people stop and listen without even realizing why. "Your Honor," he began, his tone respectful but steady. "I apologize if my appearance seems inappropriate. However, I came directly from a 12-hour shift caring for patients, including this woman here." He gestured gently toward the elderly woman sitting beside him, whose well-being depends on this hearing. For a brief second, the judge's expression softened, though only barely. It was clear the mention of the elderly woman caught his attention. Maybe it reminded him of someone, a relative perhaps, or maybe it simply humanized the situation in a way that hadn't occurred to him before. Either way, the man pressed on, knowing he had to say what needed to be said. "These scrubs aren't just clothes. They're a symbol of service. They remind me every day why I chose this path, to care for those who need it most. If arriving here in them disrespects this court, then I assure you it wasn't my intention." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. He wasn't just defending himself, he was speaking for everyone who ever felt judged based on their appearance or profession. The elderly woman beside him nodded slowly, her eyes filled with gratitude. She knew exactly how hard he worked, how much he sacrificed daily to help others, and now, seeing him stand up for himself and indirectly for her, made her proud. The silence in the room deepened. Even the bailiff, who had been leaning casually against the wall earlier, stood a little straighter, paying closer attention. People exchanged glances, some nodding subtly, others looking down at their laps, lost in thought. It was one of those rare moments where time seemed to slow down, and everything else faded into the background. All that mattered was the exchange happening between the man in scrubs and the judge seated above him. Judge Langston stared at him, his face unreadable. For a long moment, no one spoke. The judge's initial irritation seemed to waver, replaced by something harder to define. Maybe reflection, maybe regret. Whatever it was, it changed the energy in the room entirely. Finally, Judge Langston broke the silence. "You've made your point," he said, his tone softer than before. There was no apology yet, but there was acknowledgement. That alone was enough to make the man exhale deeply, releasing some of the tension he'd been holding on to since the judge first addressed him. What happened next surprised everyone. Instead of moving on quickly, Judge Langston paused again, his gaze lingering on the man in scrubs. Then, in a voice quieter than anyone expected, he added, "And perhaps I spoke too quickly." It wasn't a full-blown apology, but it was close. Close enough to make the audience murmur softly among themselves, exchanging looks of approval. Someone whispered, "That took guts," while another muttered, "Good for him." Even the elderly woman beside him gave a small smile, her grip on her cane loosening slightly as if she finally felt like they were on solid ground. But the man didn't celebrate. Not outwardly, anyway. He simply nodded once, respectfully, accepting the judge's words without gloating or pushing further. He understood that sometimes progress doesn't come in grand gestures. It comes in small, meaningful steps. And this moment, this was definitely a step in the right direction. As the tension eased and the focus shifted back to the case at hand, the man returned to his seat beside the elderly woman. She patted his arm lightly, her way of saying thank you without needing to use words. He smiled faintly, though his mind was already racing ahead. He knew this incident wouldn't end here. Something about the way people reacted, the whispers, the nods, the shared glances, told him this story was bigger than just him and the judge. Later, as he replayed the scene in his head, he realized something important. Standing up for yourself isn't always about winning an argument or proving someone wrong. Sometimes it's about creating space for understanding, for both sides to see each other more clearly. And in doing so, you open doors that might otherwise have stayed closed. By the time the hearing resumed, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted completely. What started as a tense confrontation had transformed into something else entirely, an opportunity for growth, reflection, and maybe even change. No one knew yet how far-reaching the impact of this moment would be. But one thing was certain. The man in scrubs had left an impression that wouldn't easily fade. When the hearing finally concluded and he walked out of the courthouse, still, wearing his scrubs, he felt a strange mix of emotions. Pride, relief, exhaustion, but also determination. He knew this wasn't the end of the road. If anything, it was just the beginning. As the hearing moved forward, the atmosphere in the courtroom had changed completely. The earlier tension was replaced by a strange mix of curiosity and respect. People who had been quietly observing the exchange between the man in scrubs and Judge Langston couldn't help but glance at each other, sharing subtle nods or whispers. It was as if everyone knew they had witnessed something unusual, something that didn't happen often in a place like this. Judge Langston, for his part, seemed to retreat into himself after his brief acknowledgement. He adjusted his glasses again, flipping through papers on his desk with deliberate slowness. But it wasn't hard to notice the shift in his demeanor. The sharpness in his voice softened, and his usual authoritative tone carried a hint of restraint now. Whether he realized it or not, the man's calm response had struck a chord within him, one that made him pause and reconsider what had just transpired. For the first time in a long while, the judge allowed himself a moment of introspection. He'd spent years presiding over cases, enforcing rules, and maintaining order in his courtroom. His job required him to be firm, even stern at times, because fairness depended on consistency and structure. But somewhere along the way, he wondered if he'd become too rigid, if he'd lost sight of the humanity behind the people who appeared before him. The man in scrubs hadn't raised his voice or argued back when criticized. Instead, he spoke with dignity and purpose, reminding everyone present, including the judge, that appearances can be deceiving. Those scrubs weren't a sign of disrespect. They were a badge of honor earned through sleepless nights, countless sacrifices, and an unshakable commitment to helping others. The judge began to realize that his initial reaction might have been hasty, a knee-jerk assumption based on surface-level judgments rather than understanding. Meanwhile, the elderly woman sat quietly beside the man, her frail hands resting on her cane. She watched the proceedings unfold with a mixture of gratitude and admiration. In her eyes, the man wasn't just someone accompanying her to court. He was a hero who stepped up when she needed him most. And today, he had done more than stand by her. He had stood up for himself, for her, and for anyone else who might feel overlooked or undervalued. When the hearing finally concluded, the judge dismissed the case with a few final remarks. As people began to gather their belongings and file out of the room, there was a noticeable difference in how they interacted with one another. Conversations were quieter, more thoughtful. Some approached the man in scrubs to offer kind words or express support. That took courage, one older gentleman said, shaking his hand firmly. Another woman simply smiled and nodded, mouthing the words, "Thank you," as she passed by. Outside the courthouse, reporters lingered near the entrance, hoping to catch interviews with those leaving the building. Word about the incident had spread quickly, thanks to whispers among spectators and courthouse staff. When the man emerged, still wearing his scrubs, cameras turned toward him almost immediately. Reporters called out questions, asking him to recount what happened inside. At first he hesitated, unsure whether he wanted to draw attention to himself, but then he remembered the elderly woman standing beside him, gripping his arm lightly for support. This wasn't just his story, it was hers too. "I'm here because I care about people," he told the reporters, speaking slowly and clearly so his words wouldn't get lost in the noise. "I came straight from work because someone needed me to be here. These scrubs aren't just clothes, they represent everything I believe in. They remind me why I chose this path. To serve others." His answer resonated deeply, not only with the reporters but also with the growing crowd of onlookers who stopped to listen. Someone filmed the interaction on their phone, and within hours, clips of the interview went viral online. Social media platforms lit up with discussions about professionalism, empathy, and the importance of recognizing the value in every individual, regardless of their appearance or background. But the ripple effect didn't stop there. Back at the courthouse, Judge Langston found himself facing scrutiny from colleagues and the public alike. Some criticized him for his initial comment, accusing him of bias and insensitivity. Others defended him, arguing that judges are human, too, and make mistakes. What no one could deny, however, was the significance of the moment itself. the way it forced everyone involved to reflect on their own assumptions and behaviors. Feeling the weight of the situation, Judge Langston decided to take action. He called a meeting with his team to discuss ways they could improve cultural sensitivity within the courthouse. Together, they brainstormed ideas for workshops and training sessions aimed at addressing implicit biases and fostering greater understanding among staff members. While some skeptics dismiss these efforts as mere damage control, others praise them as a step in the right direction, a chance to turn a challenging moment into an opportunity for growth. In the days that followed, the man returned to his routine, caring for patients and supporting families during some of their toughest moments. But life wasn't quite the same anymore. Strangers reached out to share stories of their own experiences with prejudice and discrimination, thanking him for speaking out when it mattered most. Friends and co-workers congratulated him, calling him brave and inspiring. Even the elderly woman whose case brought him to court expressed her heartfelt gratitude, telling him that his actions gave her hope, not just for herself, but for future generations. Through it all, the man remained humble. He didn't see himself as a hero or a role model. He was just someone doing his best to navigate life with integrity and kindness. Still, he couldn't ignore the impact of what had happened. That single moment in the courtroom had sparked something bigger, a conversation that extended far beyond the walls of the courthouse and into communities everywhere. As he reflected on everything that unfolded, he realized that sometimes the smallest acts of courage can lead to the greatest changes. By standing up for himself, and indirectly for others, he had opened doors that might otherwise have stayed closed. And though the road ahead would undoubtedly bring new challenges, he felt ready to face them head-on, knowing that progress is rarely easy, but always worth fighting for. In the days following the courtroom incident, life seemed to take on a new rhythm for the man in scrubs. The attention he received was overwhelming at first. Messages from strangers flooded his social media accounts. Reporters called asking for interviews, and even colleagues at work approached him with words of admiration. Some praised his composure under pressure. Others thanked him for speaking up when so many would have stayed silent. It wasn't something he had expected, but it quickly became clear that his response to Judge Langston's scolding had struck a chord far beyond the courthouse walls. The story spread like wildfire online. Clips of his calm yet powerful explanation went viral, sparking debates about professionalism, bias, and respect in public spaces. People shared their own experiences of being judged based on appearance or profession, echoing sentiments of frustration and relief. "I've felt invisible before," one person wrote in the comments section of a video. "Seeing someone stand up like this gives me hope." Another added, "This is what courage looks like." For the man, reading these messages brought mixed emotions. On one hand, he felt grateful that his actions resonated with so many people. On the other hand, he couldn't help but feel humbled by the realization that his experience wasn't unique. It was just one example, among countless others, who faced similar challenges daily. He began to see himself not as an individual hero, but as part of a larger movement toward understanding and change. Judge Langston, meanwhile, found himself navigating uncharted territory. As news outlets picked up the story, opinions about him were divided. Critics accused him of bias and insensitivity, pointing out how his initial reaction perpetuated harmful stereotypes. Supporters argued that judges are human beings prone to mistakes and applauded his willingness to acknowledge fault publicly. Either way, the spotlight forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about implicit biases within the legal system and within himself. Determined to address the issue head-on, Judge Langston announced plans to host a series of workshops focused on cultural sensitivity and empathy training for judicial staff. These sessions aim to educate participants about unconscious biases and encourage open dialogue about creating more inclusive environments in courtrooms. While some dismissed the initiative as a PR move, others saw it as a meaningful step toward progress. Word of the workshops reached the man in scrubs through a colleague who happened to attend one of the early sessions. Intrigued, he decided to reach out to Judge Langston personally, not to demand recognition or express anger, but to offer support. In a heartfelt letter, he thanked the judge for taking responsibility and acknowledged the importance of addressing systemic issues. "Change starts with reflection," he wrote, "and your decision to act shows leadership." To his surprise, Judge Langston responded. The reply was brief but sincere, thanking him for his understanding and inviting him to speak at an upcoming community forum organized by the courthouse. At first, the man hesitated. Public speaking wasn't something he enjoyed, and he worried about saying the wrong thing. But after discussing it with the elderly woman whose case had brought them together, he agreed. "Sometimes," she told him gently, "you have to use your voice for those who can't." The day of the forum arrived, and the room buzzed with anticipation. Community members, lawyers, judges, and local leaders filled the space, eager to hear firsthand accounts of the incident and its aftermath. When the man stepped onto the stage, dressed in his usual scrubs, the crowd erupted into applause. For a moment he stood there, overwhelmed by the warmth and support surrounding him. Then, gathering his thoughts, he began to speak. He started by recounting the events of that fateful morning, the exhaustion from a long night shift, the sting of the judge's comment, and the quiet strength he drew from the elderly woman beside him. His voice wavered slightly as he described the internal struggle he faced, whether to stay silent or speak up. "It wasn't easy," he admitted, "but I knew I couldn't let fear dictate my actions. Sometimes, standing up means letting go of pride and focusing on what truly matters." As he continued, his tone grew steadier, his words flowing effortlessly. He spoke about the challenges he'd faced throughout his life. Growing up in a neighborhood where opportunities were scarce, facing judgment because of his skin color, and working tirelessly to prove himself in a field where men like him were often underestimated. Yet, he emphasized, none of these obstacles defined him. Instead, they shaped him into someone who believed deeply in resilience, compassion, and service. "Every day we make choices," he said, pausing to let the weight of his words sink in. "We choose how we treat others, how we respond to adversity, and how we define success. For me, success isn't about titles or accolades, it's about making a difference no matter how small." By the time he finished speaking, the room was silent except for the sound of sniffles and muffled sobs. Many in the audience wiped tears from their eyes, moved by the raw honesty and vulnerability in his story. Even Judge Langston, seated near the front, nodded thoughtfully, visibly affected by the man's words. Afterward, during the Q&A session, questions poured in from every corner of the room. Some asked practical advice on handling discrimination, while others sought guidance on staying true to oneself in difficult situations. The man answered each question thoughtfully, sharing insights gained from years of navigating life's complexities. His responses weren't polished or rehearsed. They were real, heartfelt, and relatable. One attendee, a young nurse just starting her career, approached him afterward with tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching his hand tightly. "Your story reminds me why I chose this path. It gives me hope that I can keep going, even when it feels impossible." As the event drew to a close, Judge Langston took the stage once more to thank everyone for attending. Looking directly at the man in scrubs, he said, "Today reinforced something important for all of us. Progress begins with humility and understanding. We may not always get it right, but we must be willing to listen, learn, and grow." The crowd erupted into applause again, this time directed at both the judge and the man in scrubs. It was a moment of unity, a reminder that despite differences in roles, backgrounds, or perspectives, everyone shares a common desire for fairness and respect. Walking. Out of the forum later that evening, the man felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy. He knew that. But he also knew that moments like these mattered. They planted seeds of change, however small, that could grow into something bigger over time. And perhaps most importantly, they reminded him that even in the face of adversity, kindness and courage could inspire hope, not just for himself, but for everyone watching and listening. The community forum marked a turning point, not just for the man in scrubs and Judge Langston, but for everyone who attended. People left the event buzzing with ideas, questions, and a renewed sense of hope. Conversations spilled out into the parking lot as attendees lingered, unwilling to let the moment fade too quickly. Some exchanged contact information, eager to stay connected and work together on initiatives that could build on the momentum sparked by the day's events. Others simply stood there, reflecting quietly on what they had heard. For the man in scrubs, the impact of his words continued to ripple outward in ways he never imagined. Over the following weeks, invitations poured in from schools, hospitals, and community organizations, asking him to share his story. At first, he hesitated. Public speaking still made him nervous, and he worried about being seen as some kind of hero. But after talking it over with the elderly woman whose case brought him to court, he realized something important. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about using his experience to inspire others and spark meaningful change. Each speech he gave became an opportunity to remind people of their shared humanity. He spoke candidly about the challenges he faced growing up, the long nights studying by candlelight when the electricity went out, the times teachers doubted his abilities because of where he came from, and the exhaustion of working double shifts while pursuing his nursing degree. Yet he always framed these struggles not as obstacles to overcome alone, but as lessons that taught him the value of resilience, empathy, and service. "I didn't choose this path because I wanted fame or recognition," he often said during his talks. "I chose it because I believe in helping people. That's why I wear these scrubs every day. Not because they're comfortable or stylish, but because they represent a promise I made to myself and to others, to show up, even when it's hard." His message resonated deeply, especially with younger audiences. Students preparing for careers in healthcare, law, education, and other fields found inspiration in his determination to rise above adversity without losing sight of his values. One high school student approached him after a talk, tears streaming down her face. "I've been told I'll never amount to anything," she confessed, "but hearing you speak makes me think maybe I can." Moments like these reminded him why he kept saying yes to speaking engagements despite his discomfort. Every time someone walked away feeling empowered or hopeful, it felt like proof that standing up for himself that day in court had been worth it, not just for him, but for everyone who needed a reminder that courage comes in many forms. Judge Langston also underwent a transformation of his own. The workshops he initiated gained traction, drawing participants from across the legal system. Lawyers, clerks, bailiffs, and even fellow judges attended sessions designed to foster greater awareness of implicit biases and promote inclusivity in courtrooms. Though some remained skeptical, many walked away with new insights and tools to approach their work with more empathy. One particularly memorable session featured a panel discussion where the man in scrubs joined Judge Langston on stage alongside other community leaders. As they talked about the importance of respect and understanding in public spaces, the chemistry between them was undeniable. Where once there had been tension, now there was mutual admiration, and perhaps even friendship. At one point, Judge Langston turned to the audience and said, "We all make mistakes. What matters is how we respond to them. This man taught me that sometimes the hardest thing to do is also the most necessary. Admit when you're wrong and commit to doing better." The crowd erupted into applause, not just for the judge's honesty, but for the progress they saw unfolding before their eyes. Change doesn't happen overnight, but moments like these planted seeds that would grow over time. Back at work, the man returned to his routine, caring for patients and supporting families through some of life's toughest moments. But things weren't quite the same anymore. Colleagues treated him differently, not with awe or reverence, but with a deeper respect born of understanding. They began seeking his advice not just on medical matters, but on navigating difficult conversations and advocating for themselves and their patients. Even the elderly woman whose case started it all noticed the shift. She joked with him one day, saying, "You've become quite the celebrity around here." But beneath her teasing tone was pride, a grandmotherly affection that warmed his heart. "You've done good," she added softly. "Don't ever forget that." As months passed, the incident in the courtroom faded from headlines, replaced by new stories and controversies, yet its legacy endured. Teachers incorporated the man's story into lesson plans about standing up for oneself and others. Nurses posted quotes from his speeches on bulletin boards in hospital break rooms, and judges referenced the workshop discussions and training programs for new hires. Perhaps the most profound impact, though, was personal. The man in scrubs carried the memory of that day with him always. Not as a badge of honor, but as a reminder of the power of vulnerability and authenticity. He learned that speaking your truth isn't about winning arguments or proving others wrong. It's about creating space for understanding and connection. By sharing his story, he opened doors for countless others to share theirs. One evening, as he sat at home reflecting on everything that had happened, he pulled out the letter he'd written to Judge Langston months earlier. Rereading it, he smiled at how far both of them had come since then. Progress wasn't perfect, and neither was he, but that was okay. Life wasn't about perfection, it was about growth. He thought back to the young nurse who thanked him at the forum, the high school student who found hope in his words, and the elderly woman who leaned on him not just physically but emotionally. Each of them reminded him of something vital. We all have roles to play in making the world a little kinder, a little fairer, and a little brighter. And so, as he closed the letter and set it aside, he felt a quiet confidence settle over him. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew he wouldn't face them alone. Because somewhere along the way he'd become part of a community bound together not by titles or accomplishments, but by shared values and a commitment to lifting each other up in the end. The legacy of that courtroom encounter wasn't about one man or one judge. It was about the collective effort to create a world where everyone feels seen, heard, and valued. And if that wasn't worth fighting for, he didn't know what was.